Strap yourselves in and hold on tight. You're listening to The Powell Movement.
Welcome to The Powell Movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and with America Week behind us, I thought it would be important to bring a Canadian on the show. My guest this week is known for founding Freeride Entertainment and producing some game-changing mountain bike videos. I'm talking about Derek Westerlund, and he's a visionary, a guy who looked at what was happening in the world of biking. In the 20 years since he founded Freeride Entertainment, the bike world has changed, and Derek's fingerprints are all over it. The best part about Derek, though, is what a cool person he is. He's fun to be around, he tells great stories, and he's a nice guy who's not afraid to share his thoughts and opinions. Before we jump into the interview, I want to thank you for listening to the show. Ask you to please follow me on Instagram at The Powell Movement, share my posts on Facebook, and shoot me an email if you have any questions or concerns. My email is mike@thepowellmovement.com, and I'd love to hear from you. Finally, I want to thank my sponsors who make this show happen. They are Evo, Rescue Water, and the 10 Barrel Brewery. Now, let's talk to Derek Westerlund. I'm downtown in Seattle at the offices of Freeride Entertainment. And if you've heard of Freeride Entertainment, they are pretty much what made biking cool over the past 20 years. I mean, they're the equivalent of MSP in skiing. When skiing was lame, MSP came in and made it cool again. I'm here with Derek Westerlund. Hi, Derek.
Hey, bud.
And in biking, when Freeride Entertainment started, what did the landscape of the bike world look like? Because you're an innovator in that world, and it was probably lame back then.
I don't know if it was necessarily lame. It was really race-focused, abstract, and didn't really fit what was going on in the sport.
Spandex and 10 speeds?
Yeah, it was Lycra and bar ends all the way. The counterculture, weed-smoking, old-school hippie guys that started it, they had all sort of moved on and owned all the big bike companies, and it became sort of the faces of the industry as the pioneers of the sport. But a lot of the companies, there's a lot of marketing going on, but no real identity. It all just was racers changing teams every 2 years. And to this day, biking really still continues to market to itself and pretty much only itself.
The race aspect of marketing, it seems like across the board, is something that's hard to get the youth engaged in, especially these days. I mean, if you're not the best by the time you're 9 or 10, you're probably not going to pursue shaving off a couple seconds of your time. But the world that you helped create gave the industry something to market itself as cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was really inspired by Matchstick, I would say. You know, I've sort of witnessed the birth and death of action sports now to some degree. And I was around putting on ski movies and movie tours straight out of high school, trying to just hustle and be an entrepreneur and make money. And for many years, I did that with Rap Films and Warren Miller, Greg Stump. And then when Matchstick came along, I remember we had this counterculture magazine in Nelson, British Columbia called The Freak Radical. And Bjorn Inga, who was the founder of that, and my old partner, you know, we had met Murray and Steve at SIA while we were down trying to hustle advertising. And they sent us The Tribe that fall. And we sat in my house for 2 days, and that was really the moment that I went, you know, I'm really going to be a filmmaker now. Like, these guys just nailed what I believe could happen in mountain biking. And we were already filming and shooting and stuff in mountain biking, but that was like the pinnacle moment for me.
That's the inspiration right there. But before the inspiration even starts, it all grows up in the tournament capital of the world, Kamloops, British Columbia. You grew up from just a privileged childhood where you had everything from a chauffeur to a cook to none of that. So I heard you came from nothing really, and you elaborated a little bit on that earlier. But what was life like for a young Derek Westerlund?
Far from chauffeurs. You know, I grew up on the North Shore of Kamloops, fairly poor, I would say, probably the best word for it. You know, my mom had me at a extremely young age. Like, I think the first time she ever got laid at like 16 or 17. And my mother and father were sort of taken apart for family reasons. And my mom decided to have a kid that young, and I think it was really tough, and she was still a teenager. And I had a lot of support from my grandparents, who are really the only reason I'm sitting here right now. They supported everything that I ever wanted to do, from learning how to ski to growing up BMX racing to moving to Nelson to go to college, a place where I could ski and go to college at in the same day. They made it happen. They weren't wealthy people at all. They lived in a trailer and were hardworking. My grandfather was a forester and my grandmother was a chambermaid at a hotel. But they would give the last cent they had to make sure I had a BMX bike at the races on the weekend, So I just grew up, product of my environment. I had to hustle on the streets. It was a rough town. You had to fight to sort of keep your place and keep from being bullied and literally beat up all the time. So you had to get tough and you had to never stay down. And I think I just carried that sort of blue collar work ethic into being an entrepreneur, whether it was starting out writing for magazines, having a counterculture magazine. Then I started making mountain bike trail guides all over British Columbia, from the Kootenays, Kamloops, Whistler, Sea to Sky area. And that was kind of like a hustle. You could sell ads instead of selling drugs or something. So that's how we sort of got into it. And then it just became a life commitment after that.
I'm going to reel it back to childhood. I have so many questions because I didn't grow up poor. When you go to school and compare to all your friends and where they live, do you feel a difference there? Because I'm guessing that you really came from nothing. Did you move a lot and those kind of things? And were you looked at differently?
Yeah, for the families that were really stable, maybe. But North Shore of Kamloops is very multicultural. I grew up amongst so many different nationalities that I think it really opened my eyes to racism and judgment at a young age. My stepfather was Native First Nations Canadian, I guess is the appropriate term now. And back then he was an Indian, and it was derogatory. They were looked upon in a different light around the city, and that was a real tough thing. I had lots of Native friends, and until I actually learned about the oppression into the schools and what had happened till I became educated, I had a lot of those same thoughts, really. And until, you learn some early life lessons about humanity and why there might be alcoholism within a group of people or a culture of people, like until you can really look at it, it's really hard to judge. And I think coming from a multicultural place, there was a lot of racial bias, but it was very innocent. It wasn't like the fired race issues that we have today. I think just dealt with differently back then.
Yeah, I mean, everything's changed in the way that people look at race today. To see if you had a normal Canadian childhood, did you play hockey at all?
No. I skied, I rode BMX bikes, and I skateboarded just like any other kid from California or anywhere else, really. I mean, we were all influenced by the same things in that generation. Everything you have goes into those things. It's not like you have that and then a great vacation to go skateboarding in California for a week with your family or something like that. I just don't think those opportunities necessarily existed. I look back and I have friends that are, very successful in action sports industry that grew up in the same place. And I think all of us feel very much the same way. It taught us everything we knew. It taught us street smarts. It taught us how to look out for ourselves. It taught us how to be smart, taught us how to meet girls and defend ourselves and make money.
If you lived in a trailer for part of your childhood, were you into things that kids that live in trailer areas that get into, like the drugs, the partying, sex at young ages? Because it seems like the percentages of people that get pregnant in a trailer park happen to be different than the rest of the world.
Yeah, from a societal perspective, growing up in a trailer park in Kamloops is a lot different than it is growing up in Arkansas. But yeah, I would say yes to all that. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and became a teenager in the 80s. And I look at kids now that were having sex at the age I was, or that was going around everywhere, not just me, everybody I knew.
At 13 and 14.
Yeah. And I look at that now and it's disturbing to me. Like it's weird because I have kids and it just sheds a different perspective. And then partying, I mean, yeah.
When was your first beer?
I think I had my first beer in the summer between grade 7 and 8. And I never really liked beer, but I think that's when we sort of started drinking and buying a couple doobies on the weekend and taking acid for the first time in probably grade 8 or 9. And it's probably about the time.
What kind of kid were you in high school? Were you like the class clown? You definitely weren't a jock, but what were you?
Thanks, bud.
Well, I mean, you said that you like to skateboard, BMX, and ski.
That's funny. No, I did. I played quite a few sports. I never played hockey.
What other sports did you play?
Rugby, soccer, baseball.
So you played all the team sports as well?
Yeah, younger, junior high style. I played rugby up until men's league, and then I realized that it was just beating the shit out of my body. It was sort of like a way to pass out some of those Kamloops aggressions that you built up over the years and get them out and not have to bring them into your day-to-day lifestyle of living in a peaceful hippie ski town.
So you could have been a jock.
I could have done anything I wanted. I mean, I could have been a crackhead too. I mean, everybody I grew up with, so many people went to rehab and jail and had substance abuse problems. And I had some really good guiding lights in my life, people that showed me that there was life outside of Kamloops. And once I got out and could start carving my own path, I realized that all that stuff I had learned there was real life. And it's helped every day since.
You were making an income in illicit ways when you were younger?
When I was out of high school, I made a living in any way I could, hustling, whatever.
What do you do right out of high school? What's your move? Because you're into biking, and that's kind of like the early mecca of mountain biking before mountain biking existed.
Yeah, I mean, I always had a job, but I always had some sort of scam, or I sold bags of weed on the side, whatever I could do to make money to ski, basically. And then biking didn't have the same allure as powder did to me at that time. So the inspiration to travel and all that kind of stuff just came. And then, I honestly, this criminal dude I knew in Kamloops who was like into all these crazy credit card scams and stolen property rings and stuff. He moved down to Vancouver and got a job in a stereo store selling audio-visual equipment. And he was down there for a while and we had become friends. And he was like, dude, I'll get you a job. And I was like doing construction. And I was like, fuck, I would love to get out of here and get to the city and work in a mall where there's a bunch of chicks around and you could dress up every day. And I went down there and like instantly picked it up. And within 2 months was like salesman of the month and made 10 grand one month and like took all my money. And this is in the early 90s and took all my money and went to Whistler partying, went on ski trips. And I'm like, hey man, this real world work is not so bad because it's really taking your application of being able to sell somebody something or hustle and just doing it to something legitimate.
That's your skill that you developed from Kamloops throughout your life now, just thinking about you, is you can put a deal together and close a deal because you know how to hustle and make it happen?
Yeah, I guess so.
You're the one in this company from day one who was like, I got this part of it. Let me put these deals together.
Yeah. I've been around the scene for a long time. I was schooled for business and marketing, and I understand the business model behind it. I understand media and content and outcomes and quality and making impacts. So I think, yeah, I have always told that. Not by choice, man. I'd love someone else to come in and bring a few deals in, believe me.
But you're like the best at it. That's like, and in your personal skill set, if you were to strip everything away from you, the one thing that started in childhood to now that you're probably best at is making shit happen and closing the deal?
Yeah, I guess so. Closing the deal at different levels too, not just like a contractual monetary deal. I think it's like making things happen, from grandiose visionary ideas to even the smallest things. Like it takes a certain skill set to be able to actually set your sights on it and make it happen regardless of anything that stands in your way.
From my perspective, all it really takes is to be a really cool person, which you are, have a really, really strong work ethic and not want to stop, which you have, and then have that shit that you learned in Kamloops of how to hustle and put the deal together. And you put all three of those things together, people are going to want to work with you, realize you're going to work harder than everybody else, and then you're going to make them say yes.
Yeah, and I think just making it a fun experience and treating people well is at the top of that list as well. I think that's been a lifelong sort of goal for me. It's sort of our mission statement as a company. And obviously it's a small industry and you're always going to have people you don't necessarily agree with or take different paths in. But I think that is what made us successful and has so many people reaching out to work with us all the time, is just that we make it a good experience. We treat people super well, we pay them well, and we do it right.
People don't like working with dicks. Unless those dicks get 100 times better results than you do. But people like working with cool people who deliver and are fun to work with. That's one thing. But you're in Vancouver. You're working at the Hi-Fi Radio Superstore. You're taking in 10 grand sometimes a month. What do you look like? Are you acid-washed jeans, a Motley Crue shirt, and long hair?
No, I think that was grade 8. But I never wore acid wash either. I want that for the record, Mike Powell.
Okay. There's nothing wrong with the acid wash, especially if you're Canadian. You can do the tuxedo that way.
No, man. I only had so many sets of clothes back then, but I was definitely wearing Quicksilver and looked like every other skater kid with a collared shirt on and a pair of chino pants or something.
And were you into the cultures of these sports, going to all the movie premieres, and are you involved as much as you can be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the transition really happened a couple years into moving to Nelson. So probably like 93, we were pretty deep in this Freak Radical magazine and we were just making all these contacts.
You bring up the magazine and I was told that you started some kind of hippie something magazine, but then they said hippie doesn't describe it right, but then you said counterculture magazine. That makes more sense. Yeah, it was really
like there's some magazines that almost feel like they're, the mountain culture magazines of today. Really feel like the refined offshoots of that, where you're taken into things that matter in a mountain town and to that culture of ski bums and hedonists. And I did not start that magazine. It was actually some good friends of mine, Bjorn Enga and Andrew Mitchell, who really were the visionaries behind it. They were partners. Andrew moved off into doing music licensing for a bunch of the early action sport films coming out of Whistler, and then much beyond that later on with soundtracks. And Bjorn stayed on to run the magazine kind of as long as we could, and then the opportunity came up to start the Crank movies with Christian Beijing. And so we had all done a movie with Greg Stump for mountain biking, and then those guys figured they would use that as a springboard to start their own company, which ended up being Radical Films. We had Radical Multimedia, and then they started Radical Films. And so I worked with those dudes for a couple of years on the early Crank movies, and then really had a different idea of what could be done in the space, what I believed it should look like, and it wasn't what they were doing. So, we ended up going our separate ways, and that's when Freeride was really born. And sort of late 1997, I opened my first bank account, and I think April of this year was a 20-year anniversary of going on our first trip as a production company or film company.
Congratulations on that. That's hard to do.
Yeah, tell me about it.
As the body gets older, you have to keep getting good young people in here because you can't do it all anymore. You can't be the dude in the mountains carrying a camera pack anymore.
Yeah, I don't know that I ever did that too much anyway. I'm kind of a softie that way. I realized that I would never be a world-class cinematographer and moved on to the business side of it pretty early on. And I really believe that the people that are amazing at doing it all, are truly outstanding in my eyes with being able to manage a business and still go out and shoot at a world-class level. So a lot of props to those guys.
It is tough to go 20 years trying to do all of that. You wouldn't be here if you were trying to do everything. But I'm going to get back to where you said you went to school. Did you go to college after high school or after hustling? What happened there?
Yeah, I went to college. I lived in Nelson and went to college in Castlegar, British Columbia at Selkirk, and did a couple-year business program, and then got an internship at a business journal magazine. And then from there, I sort of started my own projects.
And Nelson is working for the magazine, trying to be a semi-pro mountain biker.
Yeah.
Who was giving you product?
Way back then, Oakley was one of my first sponsors, still wear their sunglasses to this day. Back then, I was riding Specialized mountain bikes, and we were the first real breakout mountain bike segment was for Stumpy's film Pulp Traction, and we were all on Specialized. Then I moved on to Gary Fisher and some clothing brands. And then I realized by, sort of the late 90s, I didn't really have the talent to go on as a rider. There was no way that was happening, especially watching like all these talented guys in front of me that were my friends that really had what it took. And so I just tapped out and said, I'll get my free shit some other way. So I started making movies, and then arguably got more than I ever needed.
You make the dream happen. You're a sponsored mountain biker, and that's great.
I will never call myself a pro mountain biker. I like to call myself a half-ass pro because I never really had a shit ton of talent. I could whip out a bike and get a couple good photographs, enough for someone to send me some free clothes and sunglasses, but I was never going to win a contest or be at that level. So yeah, that was all sort of that time in our lives where we were hustling in the ski industry. We were just doing anything we could to make connections, to live this ultimate lifestyle that so many people get into action sports for. It's like dream, like back in the day, like Stumpy and these guys, like watching Blake and Schmidt and the rap films of Trevor and Eric going all over to ski in Alaska and Europe. Like that's all I ever cared about doing.
To answer a question earlier, you were totally invested in the scene and knew exactly what was going on with all the movies. And then you get to work with Stumpy, who is like the weirdest person in the world and great at the same time. But there's no one more eccentric that I've ever met, and you probably have. But how was working with Stump?
Well, I know Greg. We've been known each other for a long time, but when we made Pulp Traction for him, it was mostly Christian Beijing, who was like a hired gun cameraman who then took that opportunity and started making his own movies. He was already a filmmaker, but the Stumpy thing was the springboard in mountain biking. Stump had the name. He went into business with Specialized. I don't think that ended so well. They just made a movie called The Moment, and it was not very well researched. And Stump, is semi-wasted these days, I would say. No offense, Stumpy. But they went to interview him, and they partied, and he did his interview the next day, and he had his story completely wrong, like sort of went off on telling Specialized to fuck off and didn't put the movie out and sort of threw it back in their face. But he sort of had gapped the fact the movie actually did come out, and Specialized lawyers put a disclaimer in before the movie. It ended up being this kind of comical thing that he had to do a retraction in, which nobody ever actually saw. But one of the guys from this mountain bike website in Vancouver sort of was scratching his head at that story. And when I saw the movie, I was like, that's bullshit. Because I was in the movie. I was the first guy in the movie that came out when it actually came out. And I was like, what the fuck are these guys talking about? And then this dude, Cam McRae, called Mike Senior from Specialized, and they set the record straight. And Stumpy had to do a retraction, which was quite humorous and also fitting at the same time.
That's not a surprise to me that there was a bad ending with Specialized on such weird terms, because he's a weird dude, and I guess there's no reason to talk about Stump anymore, so I'll probably cut that part out.
Stumpy has a strange role. He has a humongous role in my life, even though we haven't spent a ton of time together.
He's the first wave.
Well, yeah, and I was very inspired by his filmmaking, and he actually got together with a girl from Kamloops who was this smoking hot girl that had these little brothers, Ace Mackay Smith, and she had these little brothers, Stu and Adam, and they started a show in Kamloops for MTV that Stumpy was a part of. And then when we did Pulp Traction, it was one step closer to all these people from very small circles being back together. And to this day, like there's a lineage to what he did that got me here.
I mean, there's guys like Barrymore and Warren Miller who did it before Stumpy. But when Greg Stump brought his movies to the table, it created an avenue where skiers who did not race could become professional athletes. They could just go out and do cool shit, and people would pay for that. And then you guys are the grandchildren of that, because that's exactly what you do as well. But he was just the first one to do it. Blake and Schmidt were the first athletes that were able to make 6 figures to travel the world to ski, other than being a racer.
Yeah.
He is the lineage, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, and even, I've started working on this film called Nothing's for Free. It's the 30-year quintessential history of freeride mountain biking. And it starts off with Danny McCaskill, who's this basically internet sensation. Hundreds of millions of people have seen his videos.
He's turned me down for interviews at least 8 times through his people. Just want to throw that out there.
His people. Okay, we'll call Tarek right now and we'll...
That's his people.
Okay, well, we'll call him right now and we'll put him on the spot in Germany at 2 a.m. at the bar and see what he says.
I've got some favors to ask you later in the podcast. We don't need to worry about that.
All right. So Danny has been seen by so many people, and really the first character that we really need to look at as the true original pioneer was Hans Rey. And so it's this funny thing that, like, which of those guys has seen more views over their career now in this digital age where the numbers can just rack up, or guys that like Danny, who wore out Hans's tapes on a VHS till they wouldn't play anymore, and people all over the world that were in that era. And I really think there is that. And the funny thing is Hans was in The Good, the Rad, and the Gnarly, which was one of the first Stumpy movies my mom brought home for me at Christmas time one year on beta tape. Again, just 1 degree of separation of movements in time, and some of those are coming back into a really cool place in my life right now as I embark on this like big history of project. So it's really interesting to see that. And then when you move one more move on the board, and then you bring Matchstick and their inspiration and all the good friendships I've made with the other ski people, or 95% of them anyway, that it's all sort of inspired from the same few small places.
It's a smoky day out here in Seattle. When I look at the clouds, it's just a little bit gray, and that affects my mood in these conversations. So I miss my sponsors, but I'm going to bring them back in here right now. And my first sponsor is Evo, and they are hands down the best retail location in the country for bike, skate, wake, surf, lifestyle, and more. And they have everything you could possibly want for your adventure. I have personally shopped at Evo since they opened because no one comes close to the service they offer and the vibe they create. Their stores in Denver, Seattle, and Portland are some of the best retail experiences you'll find. And if you can't make it to a store, well, Evo.com has all the brands, all the products, and a low price guarantee, free shipping on orders over $50, and a no-hassle return policy. For listening to the show, they're going to give you 10% off your entire order. If you're in-store, mention the code TPM10 to your cashier. And if you're online, use the code TPM10. That's all one word with capital letters, and you'll get that 10% off. My next sponsor is Rescue Water. And now that it's summer, hydrating is more important than ever. And with Rescue Water, it's all about proactive recovery. You're probably asking yourself, what does proactive recovery even mean? Well, think of it like this. If you really need energy, you skip the coffee and go straight to an energy drink. It's a similar principle with Rescue Water. When you really need to hydrate, like when you get off the trail, out of the skate park, done at the gym, or with your run, skip the traditional sports drink and try a Rescue Water. It's science and it works. And while this is an advertisement, I really do drink Rescue Water at the end of big nights. And for me, hangovers are a thing of the past. If you've been listening to the podcast and haven't tried a Rescue Water yet, do me a favor and buy one next time you're at the store. It will make you a believer, and you can thank me later. If you don't want to go to the store, check out rescuewater.com. That's RESQ water.com, and save 20% on a 12-pack case with the code RESQWaterTPM. That is all one word. Rescue Water is also available on Amazon. My final sponsor is the 10 Barrel Brewery out of Bend, Oregon. There are so many things I can say about 10 Barrel, but first and foremost, they have amazing beer. My personal favorite is the Out of Office Pilsner, but a close second is the wildly popular pub beer. While 10 Barrel is all about beer, their roots are in action sports, and they put their money where their heart is. And you can see that in the athletes and events they sponsor, but most importantly, this podcast. Support the beer that supports action sports, the 10 Barrel Brewery. Find out more about the beers and events over at 10barrel.com. Those are my sponsors. At this point, you realize you're not going to be a pro mountain biker and you start Freeride Entertainment. When you start it, who do you start it with? How does it evolve? The idea happens. You're like, we're going to do this. And who is we?
Who was we? Well, we was really a good buddy of mine, one of the guys that was living in Nelson that I was most enamored with at the time. His name was Jeff Lawrence Hefe. He's a cool dude. You know, Nelson was a real sort of melting pot for a lot of people looking for the same sort of lifestyle at the same time. And Jeff was working on the Kootenay side of living in the Kootenays, and he had some disposable income. And I basically told him, hey, we can do this. And then we sort of got it off the ground and decided we had enough money to step out and actually try to make it happen. We bought a camera off a buddy of mine that lived in Nelson, who I bought my first house from. He was a lawyer, and he was actually a Greenpeace warrior, shot 16 mil for Greenpeace and like boarded all these whaling ships and stuff. And so we bought this Bolex off him. Turns out it had a bunch of saltwater damage. So our first shoot we went out on, we had a bunch of ruined film. And so we learned really quick that, you know, you couldn't really fuck around. Like we couldn't burn money like it was growing on trees because we wouldn't stay in business for very long. So anyway, we sorted that out and hustled our way to some more gear. And then I had really good connections at that time. And I went with my idea to Greg Fox, who owned Fox Racing. I, to this day, feel like the Fox family are the unsung heroes of action sport in a lot of ways, because they started distribution. They made probably the most influential movie of my career, which was Fresno Smooth. And Greg gave me the opportunity, even though he knew I was stepping out a little bit from under this Radical Films banner. He believed in my vision, and he believed in basically kicking the door open even harder. You know, he was supporting the other guys as well, but he was certainly visionary in the whole moto and BMX space. So in the two-wheel space, the Fox family really allowed us to get out of the gates with the distribution. That was the biggest thing. And then it was good money back then too, you know, and people were buying that shit up like it was going out of style. So nowadays, where you might get a couple dollars, some distribution deals back then, you're, you know, especially if you're selling directly, you're making like $20 a VHS tape, man. So all of a sudden we had money, and we had money to start doing these trips. And then, you know, we got these big fat paychecks for advances on our next movie because we were knocking them out, sort of knocking them down once a year and taking the sport to new heights every year. We were throwing these amazing parties in Vegas where basically Interbike, you know, everybody, the who's who, would be at these insane parties, and every year they'd get bigger and, you know, more shock value, bigger entertainment acts, bigger nights, bigger parties. And when that really ramped down, it was almost like death of a dinosaur. The whole bike industry just lost anything really exciting at those shows, you know?
Yeah, that was a lot. But to reel it back, I heard you had a pitch for your first movie. Maybe it was the first New World Disorder. And you talked to Bike Magazine and Fox, and they said, hey, we're going to give you some money. You can make a movie, but you have to get someone involved that has made movies before and done this. Is that true?
Not so much, but the fact that I had already went to Steve Winter and Murray Weiss and pitched them on that idea because they were my heroes at that time. And if there was anybody that I thought would be the best to work with and have the same style, and I had met them both at SIA maybe a couple of years earlier, stayed in touch on email. I had already sort of lined that up, and they had said, yeah, you know, come to Crested Butte. We can post the movies here. We'll be partners. We can take a bit, but we'll get it going, and they could, you know, further their empire as well. So that's how it started. And spending those first couple of years in Crested Butte, I think we edited 2 movies there with all the collective group of people that had worked around Matchstick, and met some of my greatest friends of my life in those couple of years, hanging out there. Had an absolute blast. And then, you know, we were sort of outgrew that, and then we continued to make television shows for Rush TV and work together. But we had sort of similar businesses, but we were different business people, and we wanted to make sure that we always paid absolute homage and respect to them. But where, you know, they would have their own politics and own things going on in the industry, I couldn't necessarily have the same thing they had. We had to be individuals. So To this day, we stay really close friends, and I've always supported those dudes wholeheartedly and always believed in them. And we just sort of went our separate ways in a fully amicable way. Like there was never any like split up or divorce like there is, in other companies. And, I definitely saw my fair share of that at Freeride as well. And so that relationship always maintains is really the beginnings of making it all happen.
When you're pitching it, it establishes credibility too. It makes me think of The Hustler, like, oh, I can now tell them that I got these guys on board too, and they're definitely going to jump on because I've got me and them. That's just me thinking of how you can spin that.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a different time, and there's always different spaces when you're come from the legacy of one of the biggest names in motocross and motorsports in the United States. You don't necessarily know who's making ski films, but one watch of Matchstick ski films and you knew they were, premium quality. And I think that was absolutely super important in fortifying all those early relationships.
You're in Crested Butte for a few years. You work with them for the first 5 movies or something, or they're credited at least, whatever. But eventually you guys just grow to a point where you don't need each other anymore. You're your own brands and people look at it like that. But when you're in the Matchstick days, are you in the Matchstick circle in Crested Butte, hanging out with the Seths and all the people that are coming through there?
Oh, yeah. I met all those guys. I've had a lot of fun with all those guys. I'd like to think that I skied and hung out and was able to have friendships with a lot of those guys without ego or something to offer, or just be cool with, Shane or Seth or any of those original dudes in the Matchstick world, Brant, all great dudes that I try to keep an eye out for, and always will love all those guys.
Life goes back up to Nelson and you guys just crush it on videos. And back then DVD sales are just awesome, right? Like people buy DVDs back when you started.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we used to have a full distribution center out of the upstairs of my buddy's house in Nelson, and the FedEx guy would come every day and it would smell like weed, and we'd always be laughing. We'd say it was the guy downstairs was smoking weed again, and we'd just be filling out boxes and watching the orders go out. It was a fun time. It was very innocent. It was before a lot of the business and politics got brought into it. You're just living the dream at that point.
You're making a ton of money, traveling the world, working with the best athletes in the world. It seems like life is perfect at that time.
I don't know about a ton of money, but when you grow up with nothing, it seems like a ton of money, or at least you can do the shit you want to do. And I've always enjoyed sharing, and I've also enjoyed the finer things in life. So I wanted to make sure everybody around me was having a good time. So I always listened to Styx, Too Much Time on My Hands. We listened to it at Cam Zink's bachelor party as we were going to the Motorhead concert. But it's like funny. I always want to just like make sure everybody's stoked and having a good time, because people work hard for us, and that goes a long ways.
We were walking the street after lunch and you were talking about giving money to every homeless person, where I've been trained, and I don't say this proudly, but to completely ignore them and walk by. And you were talking about one that bothered you because she was too messed up on drugs, but you gave her $5. All that goes in my head is like, $5? You gave more than a one? That is crazy to me. What everybody says about you is you're a nice dude, you're a loyal dude, you're a hardworking dude, you're a leader, visionary, but you're just a regular dude that everybody gets stoked to see. Like the awesome uncle is how I would describe it to the younger kids.
Yeah, it could be that guy for some people, for sure.
To your employees here, all these guys are so stoked to work with you and what you've created, but that's probably just a tribute to you being a nice, cool Canadian dude.
Cool Canadian dude. Yeah, I've tried to be cool. It's tough at times. There's a lot of pressure in life, and this is not an easy business, because there's an intense amount of pressure where your next job's coming from, how you're going to support all these people. But trying to be cool is, I think that's all you could go to the grave with, really, that you did your best to treat people right.
What about when it's time not to be cool? Like, I'll bring up one thing that I heard might have been an issue here. There's a ski movie company now called the Sherpas, and they do all kinds of movies. And you had an employee who, you look at employees here, like, you get a job with you guys, you pretty much don't leave until you die. And unfortunately, you had an employee die or a partner die. And we can talk about that, but we don't really have to, but because we're talking about this, which hurts as well, not as much. But Eric Crosland worked here.
And so did Dave Mossop, who's the other partner in the Sherpas. So, yeah,
both of them were here.
Yeah, both of them were here for a period of time. Yeah, that's sort of a long-lasting feud that I'll probably take to the grave, too, in some ways. In some ways, I've sort of let it go just out of, more than anything, watching Eric and I's kids play soccer together in Nelson, even though we're standing across the soccer field, not even acknowledging each other. I think that's probably because I cared so much about it that it cut so much deeper. So, as the story goes, I might as well flush it out so there can be no perception that I don't think I would say anything in here that anybody else could argue with. But, I had met Eric and Corey Horton, who actually works with me as well. They did a show called The Ride Guide, and we met them at a big Kona launch in Europe. And originally we met in the lobby of some chalet we were staying at, started talking, super cool guys. We ended up, Robbie Borden and I traveled across on this raging party tour across Europe with them in some Solomon car, and we had a great time. And Eric was really charismatic and, smart, cool dude. As we were growing, I couldn't get the guy out of my head. This is the dude, I want to bring this guy on. So, he came on and we moved him to Nelson, and, he lived with me and met his wife in our circle of friends. And we had a big family, like a true family, and we were kicking ass. And Eric was my man. And so I don't know if he got complete favoritism at Freeride, but he always had what he needed. And we were still on the upcome, we couldn't be paying people hundreds of G's at that time. And
do you pay people hundreds of G's now?
Not many.
That's a yes.
That's not, you could say hundreds. Anyways, meanwhile, the guy who was running my company, Kerry Boxer, is a good friend and basically my family. And we were on a shoot on the series that we did with Matchstick, Focused, and we were down in Brazil. We had just flown down to Brazil, went to Mardi Gras, partied for the night, got up the next day, and I get this phone call, and Eric and Kerry had gone skiing. They went to ski this gnarly line in Nelson, tough guy line, no fall zone, and Kerry fell. And so I got a phone call that Kerry had fallen and was in the hospital. I thought he broke his leg. I wasn't too stressed. And then a few hours later, I got another call as we're driving down the road in Brazil, and he had passed. And I was on my hands and knees, bawling on the side of the road. Maybe I'll start right now. Anyway, it was just a super fucked up time. Fucked up for so many reasons. He had just had a baby. Yeah. Heavy. That's never a light time for anyone. So, I came back to Nelson and I honestly couldn't do it anymore for a little while. My head was fucked up. I didn't really know how I was going to survive. And so I tried to float the canoe to the other side of the river without really paddling, and sort of got in a tough time. And our family at Freeride was really everything I had that pulled me through, everybody else's belief in it that we were going to forge on. Eric was with me for quite a few years, and, we were best friends, right? Then he brought Dave Mossop, who's one of the other founding partners of the Sherpas, in to do some editing. And meanwhile, we had started to cross over a few things with Matchstick, and Eric Horlifson was popping through the office, and a lot of these skier dudes. We were doing Cold Rush for Red Bull at the time. So all the big pro skiers were coming to town, and those dudes were around, and their calling was always to make ski movies. And I will never fault them for that. That's what they got into it for, and that's what their dream. And nobody would ever stand in the way of their dream. But sort of the way it went down was, and I will always give those guys credit for being incredible talents. They're just shitty businessmen. And maybe they've changed and grown, but the way they handled it all was pretty weak, because they were essentially, still using my credit cards and phones and going to events, working under our banner. We're behind closed doors plotting to make a ski movie. And they asked me if I wanted to EP their movie. And I was basically like, no, man, Matchstick helped get me going. I'm super good friends with TGR and CP and Johnny DeCesare and all these guys. And out of respect, I didn't really want to fuck with that. It just didn't seem right to me to go off and make a ski movie. It just wasn't my calling. I just wanted to be successful in action sports and what I was doing. And I had a lot of other opportunities with Red Bull and the commercial side and all that kind of stuff as well.
You didn't want to be associated with stepping on friends' toes that helped you get started in their industry.
Yeah.
That would even be unfavorable if you EP'd their movie. Plus, these guys plotted it all behind your back. If they would have been like, hey, man, we're thinking about doing this thing, you probably would have been supportive, even though you wouldn't want to lose them.
Yeah, I mean, Dave had already moved on, and Eric did come to me, and it was after, like, I believe the Olympics or something in 2010, and he had been up to Whistler and hung out with Dave, did some shooting, and, you know, he came to me and told me that, and, you know, right away, instantaneously, I was very guarded, and I knew it was sort of inevitable that he would go, and it was taking some time. It was like breaking up. It wasn't easy, and I'm a pretty passionate guy. I get pretty fired up and aggressive when I need to, or when I feel pushed into a corner. And so there was a bit of stress, and so I said, okay, fuck it, you're going. You sign a non-compete, or we're done, man. And then it's game on. It's war. So he ended up eventually coming in and doing that, which I thought was the respectful thing, because he had seriously met everybody at Red Bull, all the money sources, and he was my man. So he forged his own relationships with them. So now all of a sudden I've let someone in the inner circle and didn't see it coming. I think that's the absolute bottom line, is I just didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
And then boom. And, you know, they always made the justification. That's what happens. You kind of work your way up and then you do your thing. And I agree with that. You know, I did the same thing. I won't fault them for that. It's really, as the plot thickens, Kona Mountain Bikes, they were my family. They had sponsored every one of our movies. I was very good friends with the owners. I had done everything, traveled the world with these guys, partied, been to their homes, helped their wives go on trips across the planet. I'd done everything. And at that time, we were ramping down the 10th New World Disorder, and we were certainly coming to a crossroads because the business model of sponsoring movies and everything had changed. And we quit making movies like going out on top. That's where we wanted to go out on, the absolute top. And so basically Eric came in, signed the non-compete. We went our own way for a very short period of time. And then I got a call from the owner of Kona, and basically I had a personal loan out to them that I was, you know, paying back in small drolls over the years. And essentially I found out that Eric was going to work for Kona. And with a bit of a plot with Mitchell Scott and Eddie Mercelet, a couple other guys that worked there, and Sean Smiley Nesbitt, who I had got a job at Kona being the team manager. So basically now all of a sudden, you know, I had to look at 4 of my good friends and work colleagues that I work with all the time and wonder, how long had this been going on for? Was this like plot? And so, you know, then I got pretty aggressive and was like, you know, fuck these guys. And have certainly will always speak my mind on how that was handled. And yeah, you know, I've got a text message to tell me that it was handled poorly or whatever, but sitting down mano to mano is really the only way that it would ever get solved. And it's never happened. And so I don't talk about it, but that's essentially what happened. And of course, there's 2 sides to every story. But in a nutshell, there was a pretty ballsy move. And those guys did it at the perfect time. They rose to the top of ski filmmaking very quickly, and they had a springboard. And not everybody gets that. And so for the people that work their fucking balls off, I found it to be sort of a cheap way to get there, you know, take other people's resources.
I think the most important thing about all of this is, whose kid's a better soccer player?
I would give that one to Crosland. Our wives are both very competitive at soccer, and his wife is probably the best in Nelson, and their little son, Caden, he's a machine out there. So I'm going to give him that.
Does your wife still talk to his wife?
Oh, yeah, they're great friends. And Jeremy Grant, who's a director and second longest employee here, they're best friends.
So you two just make it super weird, but one day you guys could sit down, have a beer, and maybe it would be better, but you'll never forget it because loyalty is everything to you.
You know, to be honest with you, Mike, like if I handled it like I would have growing up, where I just punched all of those guys once, it would all went away. It's amazing the relief that is. I did some kickboxing and MMA training a couple years ago, and I just always used to think like their smiling faces were on the punching bag, and it used to bring me sort of great calmness that I could just get it out that way, because it's such a wrong way to get out your emotions or your feelings, but there's something very liberating about it as well. And I think it's just never really came to that head. And I've seen most of those other guys, but friendship and loyalty means absolutely everything to me, and getting backstabbed, those wounds don't really go away for me.
You got fucked there. You built these guys up. On their end now, they feel like you didn't handle it well. But on your end, you're a good dude and they betrayed you.
I never gave them their talent. They're extremely talented.
Those dudes are more talented than, I would say, almost anyone. They probably made some of the movies here that you had better just because those dudes are crazy, insane talented.
I think they were coming up then. I give them a lot of credit in their filmmaking, but I won't give them that. I mean, we were all the team back then. They learned a lot coming and having the resources of a film company to work with.
Sherpas doesn't happen without you. They learned the whole business, all their connections from you.
Yeah, I would say that's to some degree, and I help them in other ways. Yeah, you can come in and be a spy, and you can learn everything you need to learn with your own sort of goals in life. And I guess I just never, like I said, I just didn't really see it that way at the time because I trust everybody so heavily. And again, I don't have a lot of nice things to say, but it definitely divided a town. You talk about a small ski town, and all of a sudden you got a pretty big line in the sand, and you got everybody all as one big family. And then there's a dude there was a lot of times where if I would have ran into that guy, I probably would have hit him. And I don't want to be that guy either. I'm grown up, like punching people out. It seems like that's something I did when I was 18 on the regular, or at least.
I've never punched anyone in my entire life except for my sister.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time for me, besides that punching bag.
So now we're going to get to another heavy part of your life, because you've had a successful career. You've built an empire. You've helped make a sport a lot cooler than it was before you entered it. And you've done well doing it. You've been able to raise a family in Nelson and Seattle, which is a tough thing to do. You said you paid a couple people $100,000. I hope you're one of them. So it sounds like you're doing well, living the dream. How old are you?
47 now.
Now, I don't know if you had a heart attack, but you had something where you had to have heart. Do you have a scar? You had heart surgery,
No,
I think.
I don't have a scar, actually. And yeah, I did have heart surgery. I developed a irregular heartbeat at 45 years old. I was on a pretty heavy party bender here in Seattle, as a matter of fact, when Guns N' Roses got back together, and a couple of my closest mates flew into Seattle, and we rented a boat for a couple of days, and we just basically partied. And literally the day it was over, I had to fly back to Nelson, and we had a bunch of Guns N' Roses entourage from the show. We're all staying at the hotel where we were staying, which is right by our office, blah, 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 and we have a whole bar here. So we had all these random people after the concert at the office. I wake up the next day and like literally one of the worst coma hangovers ever, and that's saying a lot. And I met Slash in the lobby of the hotel, which was cool.
Check that off the list.
Check that off the list, yeah. He gave me a man hug. I think he might have cursed me at the same time. But anyway, the day after it was all over, I had flown home. My wife's a wedding planner. I went home to get my boys, and I just felt fucked up. Like, I just didn't feel right. I was done, and I got back, and I took my boys out, and I couldn't eat. I couldn't do anything. And I went home, and my wife came home from a long day, and she like put her hand on my chest, and she's like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "What?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not okay." And so turns out I was in atrial fibrillation, which was like basically a irregular heartbeat or heart arrhythmia, and came out of nowhere. So I ended up going to the hospital that night.
Do you think you're going to die?
Yeah. And then that got really heavy. My old man checked out at a super young age. He had a heart condition, and I didn't have a lot of information on that because we weren't tight or a family and without digging up medical records. So very high chance it was hereditary, but there's also this thing called holiday heart, which is pretty common where people, they do their regular day world and they go to Mexico and they pound margaritas until they're wasted, and then drinking's really heavy on the heart. So essentially I just didn't come back from it because I had taken, that drinking sort of pretty excessively. And I had to end up getting the paddles and get my heart shock back into rhythm. And it immediately went back out again. So instead of what normal people would go home and they would rest, I literally went the next day to Whistler to Crankworks and went right back in the thick of it, and immediately had to get another cardio version, get the paddles, get my heart snap back in. I was doing heli drops and like right back at it. It's like I was fixed because I got the paddles. So long story short, because I lived like that, I just went a couple, 3-4 times. I took a helicopter in the Yukon to get the paddles so I could go back to work. And I realized, holy fuck, like this is serious. Like it was kind of weird because I was handling it in the completely the wrong way because I was trying to make it go away.
You're using paddles as maintenance? Oh, I just need to get shocked. I'll just recharge my battery.
I got to get back to work. That's no shit, man. I flew in a helicopter, drove for 2 hours in the Yukon to Whitehorse, got the paddles, flew back, was back on set the next day, like working. And I just didn't give myself any room to actually realize what was happening. And the business was changing a lot. I felt so much pressure. And then all of a sudden, holy fuck, I have a health problem. And all I know is that was a heavy weekend of drinking that I never came back from. And so I ended up getting a procedure called a heart ablation, where they basically go in with nitrogen through your groin and they put a balloon in your chest and they essentially weld lines of scar tissue, which allows the electricity to pass through. And then I've been better ever since. The moment the surgery was over, I've been better. And to be quite honest, I think it was probably one of the bigger eye-opening life lessons that I've ever had, because I've got a lot more aware of health, longevity, anti-aging, all that stuff, which I think is really important. And it's made me think about not turning off the switch when it was so easy to turn on and not turn off.
If I'm in your spot and I feel like I have to call an ambulance, hopefully they can get here before I die. I need to make it to the hospital. And you probably thought like, holy shit, I might die here.
To me, I almost died. Every day for a couple of months, man, I was tweaking, and it really made things like the Sherpas shit very immaterial in my life very quickly.
Is that why your movies have changed? Because if you look at, not your movies, because now it's edits and different pieces for brands, but you used to do the gnarliest of gnarly. We didn't talk about Rampage, but you're like a founding member, I feel like, of Rampage, who's been there since day one. You worked on Felix Baumgartner, too, jumping out of space into the Earth. He was in Mars.
Stratosphere.
Mars, stratosphere, whatever. But now it seems like putting out Gus Kenworthy edits and things that tell stories more than maybe what you were about before. I mean, I look at North by Nightfall, and it was like you were going to tell the story of a guy's vision and then him passing the torch to the future of the sport. And Gus is telling a lot of different stories and acceptance, and maybe not stories you told before you had your health condition. And does that play into it at all or no?
Honestly, like I will tell you very clearly that I think that's a changing in the times. And Jeremy Grant really directed Where the Trail Ends and North of Nightfall. I'm there as like Obi-Wan Kenobi guy with it. But, when we were making New World Disorder, it was about rock and roll and blowing people's mind and sort of veritable rock star, that sort of lifestyle. And I think that lifestyle's never really completely left me. But as we start to talk about the things that matter on the planet, like we work with lots of different directors now. I'm a fair weather director. I'm a businessman. I like to make deals happen. I like to tell great stories. I'm a filmmaker at heart. That's what I like to do. But it's really those other directors that have led the charge on a lot of those recent edits that are a lot more emotionally charged and a lot more storytelling driven. So nothing to do with my heart. My heart gets me to talk about all the old stories of the past when I used to be able to have tons of fun and not think about it.
Regardless of what the doctors say, you still have fun and you're very health conscious. And I don't even know where I'm going with that now. And you know what? It doesn't even matter. I've had 3 of these 10 Barrel Brewing Out of Offices. And yeah, I'm getting there. And you know what? We haven't talked about much that I can remember in this podcast, but that doesn't matter because I have this awesome section of the show. It's called Inappropriate Questions. And I get someone else to ask you 3 questions that are very inappropriate. I'll chime in probably and ask you questions about your answers. But I picked one of your employees. He's the one who emailed me out of the blue a long time ago. And he's like, hey, if you ever want to interview Derek, we're not too far from your house. Then we met and it was, oh yeah, we should definitely do this interview. I reached back out to him and I was like, you're going to ask the inappropriate questions. And he is Colin Quick Gunther. I don't like hyphenated names at all. I just don't get it.
It's a millennial thing.
Yeah, or maybe like his parents just combine the names like Quanther or something like that. It would be way better. He's got a website. I think it's colingunther.com. So whoever the second name is, you're not as important as the first.
You realize I burned this guy on stage at the movie premiere and I bust his balls all the time. So I'm sure he's going to kill me.
Colin, are you ready to jump in with inappropriate question number 1?
I think so, yeah.
Fire away.
What was the best business deal of your career? You're a world-class wheeler and dealer. I've seen you in action. What would you say was the best deal you've ever made in your career?
I will tell you what the best business deal I ever pulled off was. For the beginning of New World 4, we did a film shoot in a strip club in Vancouver, famous strip club called the Number 5 Orange. And it's owned by, I think, a biker club, or it was at that time.
Like a Trek or Specialized?
No, like the Hells Angels. Yeah. So I rented the entire bar from 11 a.m. till they close at 2 in the morning with open bar and all the strippers for $8,500. And we filmed in there and partied like it was like a Motley Crue tour. And we shot. Panavision donated 35 mil cameras to us. And we had all our friends from the industry do cameos in the intro with all these strippers. And it was super rock and roll and super fun. And yeah, to this day, that's the best deal I ever made.
I'm sure there's a director's cut that is pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, it's a good one. And we had our friends at BCDC do a rendition of For Those About to Rock, and it was For Those About to Ride. And we had them playing in the corner of the bar. And we went, I was very inspired by Matchstick's openings of cool.
How they put the logos in and...
Yeah, exactly. So it was a real good time. We had the World Cup of mountain biking was in town, so our sponsors from Europe and everywhere, so they all got to be in it, all got to see themselves on the big screen at the end of the year, and it went over super well, and it was a legendary party. Till the big boss that sat behind the desk at 2 o'clock in the morning called me up to his office, and that's when things got real, but it was good until then.
That is inappropriate question number 1. We'll go into number 2.
What was the one moment that you were like the most fucking scared? Like the most gnarliest shit?
I don't know if these are too inappropriate.
Not inappropriate, but you're in a world where there's fear, there's death. When have you been the most scared where you're like, I'm going to die right here and I have a kid and one in my wife's belly? At this point in your life, I would think everything's reeled back. Like risk is minimal compared to what it was 20 years ago. But at one point, you had a lot riding on your life and you probably peeled back because you were scared of that.
Yeah. Wow, man. I mean, to be honest, I'm a pretty conservative and I usually plot what I do a couple of moves ahead of time and I don't usually do stupid things. So I've never really been, I don't know, man.
But you've been in gnarly spots because you're shooting or you're being with gnarly athletes in the field.
Honestly, like the most heavy thing for me ever was when Zink a couple years ago backflipped the Oakley Sender at Rampage, and his wife was there with Ayla in her stomach, his firstborn, and he had just had a hematoma, bled off his leg. He was fucked up. He had beaten himself down, and he was just like, he wouldn't not do this. And being a father, when I became a dad, I became super mortal. Like I just like freak out, like pull over on the side of the road, start crying that I wasn't going to see my kids grow up and like all this like fast-paced lifestyle. And when he was doing that and Amanda was there and I was just like, what are you doing? And then he stomped it and I was like, holy fuck. And I just started crying. And, you know, I'd been in some heavy shit before. I'd been with people when they were paralyzed and stuff, but this heightened sensitivity of that emotion was, I would say that was it.
It is heavy. You're not a pro athlete. He is. He is meant to do that. His wife is meant to sit through that moment of agony, and that's going to pay for his kids' college because that's what his natural ability is. Your natural ability is the vision, the hustle, the leadership is what you got from growing up. And I remember once in my world, I was on a peak somewhere that I shouldn't have been, and I was thinking, where's the easiest line down? I have a kid. I'm going to fucking die up here. I don't want to go on these trips anymore. Did that ever happen to you when you had kids?
You know what's crazy, man, is I just lived through that in March of this year. I went to Valdez. I do a team splitter heli skiing trip every year with a bunch of my buddies. You know, there's sort of the foundation members that are there every year, and then new people come and go because those trips aren't for everyone, and timing and money and all that shit is always top of mind when it comes to that stuff. And I went this year, I'm like, you know, I'm going to really focus on skiing. I'd done a bunch of heli days. I thought I was like in really good shape, and I got there and, you know, it snowed a ton, super heavy avalanche danger. And then the winds came in as they have the last couple of years in Valdez, blew a lot of the snow away. We're like in the white ice couloir from Doug Coombs's memorial stones, and the first couple turns are just white ice. And I have no idea, never been here before. It's rowdy as fuck. And every year I go there, like I jam out on a run or two. Like I jammed on Meteorite a couple of years ago because it was just too heavy for me to get my head around. I just, you know, found out I had some health issues, so my head was not in the right space. You know, it sounds like an excuse. It was because I was scared.
Yeah.
And this year I went back and I was like, I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to stay up late, you know, but you get in those lodges and you're snowbound, you start partying. And then we got a couple runs in with hangovers where, you know, 4,000 foot couloir that takes 20 minutes to ski down or 15 minutes to ski down. And it's mixed conditions. And I grew up shredding for 25 years in the best powder in the world. I don't know how to function. I didn't grow up in Whistler or some place where there's like big alpine lines with a bunch of ice and ski them on the regular, you know, like I'm a powder skier. And so I was shitting my pants a few times this year, basically like scared. I don't really like being scared, especially when I'm paying lots of money. I want to ski epic pow and like, I want to get after it and ski steep rowdy lines, but I don't want to be shitting my pants. And there was a few times this year with the culmination of a bunch of things, I was just downright scared. And then I started wondering if that's what I wanted to do those big, high exposed lines. Like I got kids. I don't want to Tommy off some cliff like my old business partner and never see his kids again.
That became a good inappropriate question. It might not have started out as one, but we will go with number 3.
So I vaguely recall from like the ether of the Freeride family and the rumors going around that there was an incident where someone on one of the early NWD shoots called a bunch of prostitutes to a writer's room.
That is a great prank. I mean, it's amazing. So I'm going to inject here, which I always do. My kid has a friend, and his friends have parents. I'm friends with those parents. A couple of nights ago in West Seattle at 4 a.m., a prostitute shows up at their house, knocks on the door, like the husband walks downstairs and he's like, she's wearing like clear heels, makeup everywhere. And she's like, he said this address, the silver truck. He's like, oh, my truck's white. That address is a block over. And that's never happened to me. But on a shoot that you were on, we're hearing that 4 to 5 to 7 prostitutes were called to a writer's room. The greatest prank ever. Did this happen? And did the writer just pay for him and be like, fuck it, man, this is pretty cool?
I think it's only a prank if you don't call it yourself. But I would say that's probably happened a couple of times. Well, athletes on the road, it's sort of like you never know what's going to happen. But yeah, it's hard to distinguish some of those nights. You know, there's been many of them.
Your boss here has had a pretty incredible life, right? Yeah. It's easier to talk to you about your boss's life than talk to your boss about his life. I mean, your life's been pretty average. You know, you've gotten a couple good jobs. Yeah, I mean, you're working for your boss, you know? Like, you probably had a decent family. You got to this point. Yeah. You got a sweet job with this guy. Yeah. But he's this guy who started from, like, the trailer park. You ever see 8 Mile?
Yes, I'm a kid in the 90s.
Yeah.
I'm familiar.
He's like the 8 Mile of the mountain bike world. And he has worked himself into the best country in the world, arguably these days. A while back, no argument whatsoever. Yeah. But these days, arguably, I think we're still the best. You're still our hat. But he's a Canadian who's made a name for himself in America and all over the globe. I thank you for being on the podcast. It's cool to meet a visionary in a sport and be able to sit down at a table and realize you're just a regular dude who worked really, really hard, believed in what you believed in, and made everybody else believe in it, and you carved a path. And through all the changes, through the end of DVDs, you've been there and been relevant, and you changed the world of mountain biking, and who knows what is next. I'm going to guess it's storytelling, but that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, bud. Keep doing what you're doing. It's killer.
So that was time with Derek Westerlund, and an awesome guy who came from nothing and really helped change the look and feel of mountain biking for the better. He is still doing it today. And crazy story about this podcast. So I do it on a Friday. On Sunday, I get a text from one of my kids' friends' parents. And they say, hey, do you want to come over for a play date? I say, sure. So we head over to their house. And my friend, we'll call him Dirk, invites me into his house for a beer. We head down to the garage. He's wrenching on a car seat. And I'm telling him the story about Derek and his heart issue at age 47. While he's wrenching on the car seat, my friend ends up pinching his finger between the wrench and a screw or something. I don't know what happened, but I could see pain on his face immediately. He steps back and sits down in a chair, and I ask him if he had cut his finger or if it's a blood blister, and he says it was a blood blister. I'm not really making eye contact with him at this time, but I say, well, at least it's not a heart attack. And then I look up, and my friend Dirk is on the ground, and he does not look like he's alive. He's not breathing. His face is turning blue. His lips are turning white. And I look at him like, hey, man, are you just fucking with me? Because that is not cool at all. And for the first 10 seconds, I just sat there because when I said heart attack and I looked up and he was laying down, I figured it had to be a joke. As awesome as this guy is, he is quite eccentric, and I figured that's a joke that he might want to pull on me. But when I called for his wife and he didn't react, I knew something was seriously wrong. Now, I have been on a ton of trips where you need medical professionals on hand in case anything goes wrong. But I've never been that medical professional. There's always been guides. Everything's always been there for me. So I don't have the training, per se, to save my buddy Dirk's life. So what do? Well, if you've watched the movie Dumb and Dumber, there's a scene where they poison one of the bad guys with some rat poison. And the first thing Jim Carrey's character does is put both of his hands over his head and gives him a huge punch in the chest. Well, that's what my dumbass does. I say to myself as I'm doing this, I don't even know what to do right now. I end up hitting him in the chest. Then I start working on chest compressions. His wife sprints downstairs. She's calling 911. We don't know what's going on. This is going on for 2.5 minutes from start to finish, so it's crazy. It looks like he's choking to me, so I decide I'm going to pick him up and give him the Heimlich maneuver. I pick up his 200-pound body like it was nothing. I give him the Heimlich about 5 times, first time giving the Heimlich maneuver as well. At the 5th time, he kind of walks out and becomes kind of normal again, given a sweaty, normal mess, but he's alive, breathing, talking, and totally confused. He doesn't know what happened. And at the end of the day, it turned out to be a seizure. And I don't know what he's found out from medical professionals because it's not my area to pry into that. But I sat with him for a few hours and he didn't go in the ambulance and go to the hospital, which is fine because he was feeling better. And he was going to get medical attention the next week. But just a crazy story all around. And now that I know my friend Dirk is alive, there are some funny parts to this story that I need to share. And hopefully someone will be better prepared than I was in this situation, even though I am 1 for 1 now in life or death situations. My friend Dirk looked like he was going to die, and he didn't, and I will take a little of the credit for that. But here are the funny things that happen afterwards. Dirk looked at me, and he's rubbing his head. He's like, man, my head hurts. And I'm like, oh, yeah, man, when I first tried to pick you up, I dropped you on your head and it was pretty hard. I knew that was going to hurt. And he's like, oh, okay, thanks, man. And he's like, yeah. And my ribs and my chest. I'm like, oh, well, the chest compression, the punch, and the Heimlich will definitely hurt your chest, I would think. And he's like, and my jaw too, man. That really hurts. Well, I needed to clear your airwaves, so I used all the strength I had to try to rip your jaw open, and it wouldn't rip open. The moral of the story? Don't tell anyone else Derek Westerlund's heart story, because who knows what's going to happen. And be much more prepared than I was in that situation, because while everything worked out at the end of the day, it was still the scariest situation I've ever been in my entire life, and I felt completely unprepared, and that's not a good feeling. What is a good feeling is winning the X Games at age 16, and my guest next week did that. He's a guy who's known for not doing too many interviews, kind of quiet, one of those guys that lets his talent speak for himself. I'm talking about Aaron Feinberg, and in Aaron's words, he lived and died with rollerblading, and he tells us the story. There's not too many people that do it as young as Aaron and hit the top of their sport. Well, Aaron was able to make that happen, and it's a cool podcast next week. Until then, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. I want to ask you to share my posts on Facebook, review me on iTunes or whatever other platform you listen to me on. And I need to thank my amazing sponsors. They are Evo, Rescue Water, and the 10 Barrel Brewery. They really make this show happen. I love all their products. I hope you do too. And have a great week, everyone.